Hello and welcome to another episode of The New Frontier. We were quiet for a long time, but we're back with another banger, and this time even more excitingly, back with Joe. How are you doing, Joe?
Yeah, good. You sound like a British MC. We're back with another banger. It is going to be a banger.
It is. And following up on last week where we debuted the sensor tower data of Rufus adoption, which was just staggering. If you can go back to listen to that episode from Ian with Sensor Tower, which said that 60% of people or heavy Amazon shoppers were using Rufus. This one is arguably just as exciting or even more exciting, especially for us in Europe, as we have the first UK Rufus data that I've ever seen collected by Generate, which I believe is a British company. So that's fantastic. And they have some really counterintuitive breakdowns of demographics and usage, which I'm not going to spoil. Instead, I'm going to bring out Artem.
It's going to shock you, so you have to watch till the end.
Artem, how are you? How's it going?
So good. Thanks for having me on, guys. Yeah, and excited for this opportunity to share our latest research.
Do you want to briefly introduce yourself and Generate, and then let's just jump straight into the data, because I know people will be very excited to hear that.
Yeah, sure. Generate, put simply, is a data company. Through our fully consented metered panel, we help businesses to make faster, smarter decisions through a series of data sets, whether that is clickstream, e-receipts, but now importantly also Gen AI. And I think that has been the focus of this research, where we analyzed how people prompt within Rufus, the responses that come out of Rufus, and everything within. So yeah, I'm happy to dive in. I think first, maybe speak about the methodology a little bit. As just mentioned, we do collect real user prompt and response data within LLMs like Rufus. Within that, though, through our panel, when users actually join the panel, we also collect their declared demographics. So think, if you're joining Max, you can declare your age, gender, highest level of education. And that is used as an additional data set that we can connect our Gen AI data to through one persistent user ID. And that's quite important when we are then able to then quickly analyze who is actually using Rufus and who's using Rufus the most. Yeah. And the way stat from this report is very counterintuitively, it is in fact the older generations, so the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, who we found index the highest in Rufus usage. This goes completely against the typical AI trends. You would think it would be the early adopters of Gen Z, the students who are utilizing this. In fact, when analyzing whether that is Gemini or ChatGPT data, that's what we see. But for Rufus, it's entirely the opposite.
So that's really crazy. I was definitely not expecting that. Obviously, we are in such a AI bubble, and we think obviously young, like tech savvy. But actually, maybe it makes sense, because from a behavior point of view, I think older people are like much more tending to ask questions and try to like dig deep into like features, etc. So if you really think about what we're talking about, it makes sense, but not in an intuitive level where you're like, oh no, it should be a younger person.
Yeah. I think for me, this points to what I often say to customers and really anyone who will listen to me, which is people use Rufus, but they don't realize they're using Rufus. So if you ask your grandma or your mum or aunt or whoever, do they use Rufus? They'll just have no idea what you're talking about. But the reality is they are engaging with it. So yeah, it's really interesting just to see this in the data.
No, for sure. I think let's just double click into that. Because what blew me away as well, I did not expect this trend to come out. And when it did, we had to double and triple check the data. But ultimately, when you start looking at Rufus usage as an index versus the non-Rufus user, you start seeing this age adoption curve, right? Is that the older you are, peaks with baby boomers, the more likely you're to use Rufus versus just the general population. Now, what's more interesting also is that it's not a trend that's only seen by generations. You can also skip to employment level. And as you can see here, it is those who are retired that index the highest. So in the US, 140 index, in the UK, 157. So significantly more likely to use Rufus If you're retired, if you're the older baby boomer, then we call it the Gen Z, the students. And Joe, like you, I think firstly it's counterintuitive, but then it does start making sense, right? It's within Amazon, you're experiencing this choice paralysis when you're presented with hundreds of products for one query. Perhaps having this digital assistant to help you along your journey, to help make that purchase happen, actually starts being super useful for the older demographics.
Can I just ask, Artem, can you just explain for the listeners? So we've got a graph here that says retired people, 157, you adopt Rufus. What does that number mean? And maybe just talk for a little bit, just for anyone who's listening rather than watching.
Sure. So here we are looking at Rufus users, and we're essentially dividing them by the proportion of the non-Rufus users for that demographics. So what we're seeing that as a percentage, the retired users are much more common in the data when it's Rufus versus the non-Rufus users. And from a methodology perspective, actually also to maybe link on this, here we analyzed just the Android side of our panel across the US and UK. And when we say used Rufus, what do we mean? So I think it's quite important. Within the app, you have different levels of usage, right? So you can see the Rufus button. We don't track the click. We're not saying that Rufus usage is determined by someone typing in but not submitting that prompt. What we are tracking specifically is a user clicked and submitted a prompt and hit enter, or whether they have clicked one of those buttons within the product display pages. And that's what we're counting as Rufus usage.
So is 100 normalized, and therefore 157 means older folks are 57% more likely to use it than a normal? Okay.
Correct. From an index perspective, but much more prominent and much more likely to use. I think with that also, what are the reasons for this? I think one other factor could also be, generally it is the older demographics that have that higher buying power. And I think this will be the next chapter of our research. What are the outcomes? But when you think about it, it does start to make sense. If you're making a more higher AOV buying decision, having a shopping assistant there is actually super useful and handy for you, right? Conversely, when you start looking at these students that, again, controversially under-index, you'd think, why would a digital native student under-index for a Gen AI agent? But then, yet again, when you consider likely a lower salaried worker, if they're working at all, if they're not just studying, if you consider they're likely so digitally native that they're accustomed to using this Amazon app and they want to make that purchase quickly, maybe using Rufus in those instances is actually slowing their purchase journey down.
I think actually to that point, I think it's actually interesting because part of the reason I think this happens is because different generations have different purchasing journeys. I feel that the younger generations are using a lot of, for example, TikTok as a research platform, and a lot of the traffic coming from younger generations is probably informed from somewhere else already, versus older generations, which probably their first touch point really is Amazon. And so therefore their user journey starts, or their research journey starts on the platform, versus a far more informed, let's say, younger demographic that might have already been informed about the product or about the brand beforehand, either on a social media platform or Google or LLM. So I feel that probably does play a role in this as well.
I was just writing notes. I'll add that to the next piece of research because that would be a great piece to confirm.
Awesome. Let me know.
Yeah, it is really surprising when you just digest it, that the guys in high school and girls in high school are less likely to use it than the retired folks. That is mind-blowing. If you think about just how AI native these younger generations are, all of their essays written by ChatGPT or Claude, and yet it is crazy.
That's great. Fascinating. Anyhow, I think moving on, some more insights for you guys. And here we looked at user engagement with Rufus. So specifically those who have engaged with Rufus. And what you start seeing in play is a very clear power law distribution come out. You'll start seeing the top 10% based on usage. So we say usage, that means prompt volume essentially. The top 10%, that power user, that top decile, are actually in the US making almost 12% or 12x more prompts than the bottom 50%, which is humongous, right? In a similar way, you're seeing 5.1 sessions, meaning that Rufus is being utilized as this recurring utility for quite a large and likely over time a growing share of Amazon customers. And like we spoke about before, Max, I think this goes hand in hand with what Ian Simpson from Sensor Tower had also found, that it's these power users actually adopting Rufus so frequently within their shopping sessions.
Yeah, I'm just trying to bring up some comments from the chat. Artem, if you want to reflect on any of these comments, feel free to do, and keep sending them, everyone.
Sure. They're very difficult to see at the moment. Shall we cover them at the end?
I'll read it out. Katie says, this makes sense. When a younger demographics arrive at Amazon, they already have levels of trust in their intended purchase compared to older. Maybe she's referencing the TikTok point that Joe made there. So yeah, I agree.
Awesome. In that case, let's proceed. Now, the other big piece of the research was analyzing the specific Rufus prompt intent. So as I mentioned before, we are able to see the distinct prompts being made by users within Rufus, and also the responses that Rufus provides. Now, on this, whilst looking at these individual user prompts is interesting from an anecdotal perspective, from an example perspective, it does become much more interesting when we do aggregate these fields into these broader trends and insights. And within this report, that's exactly what we did. So we focused on 4 distinct ways to divide the intent to truly understand how and why people prompt within Rufus. I think before I go into the insights themselves, maybe people are not aware of this, but I definitely became very quickly aware of just the difference in the utility of Rufus between the markets. In the US, for those who don't know, Rufus is quite sophisticated. It has this activated persistent account memory, meaning it can see your historic purchases, searches, your preferences. The long and short of it, it can make some really great recommendations for you based on it knowing you. Whilst in the UK, as you can see on the screenshot, I was making these prompts and I was being blown away. When you ask for like prompts, you get just a link to the right page. Ultimately, if you live in the UK and you're using Rufus for specific intents, it's not useful at all, at least for now. This will change quickly, I'm sure. I'm sure Amazon will bring these features over, but for now, that's not the case. And this is a huge driver, I believe, in the behavioral differences we see between the markets in the following slides. Just reading that comment.
I'll add on to that, as someone who worked at Amazon, for sure, what they have in the UK, in the US, we get in Europe about 6 to 9 months later. So it is and there'll be some PM of Rufus somewhere looking at all of these cool features that the US have and prioritizing what the UK market will want, and that will be someone's job, and they'll be bringing them all over. So I think it's always a case of the US gets as the biggest market in the home market, the cool stuff first.
No, of course, completely understand. But with that, I think let's dive into the analysis. All right. So the first way we classified data was by the jobs to be done framework. So put simply, what job is Rufus doing for you when you're prompting? And to do this in a more simple way, what we did was classify not just the individual prompts, but rather the prompt sessions, whether it was a single prompt or a multitude of, let's call it 5 prompts. But ultimately, what we wanted to understand was, if you're in a shopping journey, what are you using Rufus for? And the insights are quite fascinating. So let's dive in. So firstly, from the US side, the key driver of the jobs to be done is actually comparative selection. So that is, imagine a prompt such as compare with similar items for Roku voice remote. So people in the US are using Rufus ultimately to evaluate alternatives before buying, which is almost part of discovery, but you're already mid shopping session. You're comparing versus other items. The next big bucket, and you start seeing this across both markets, is that technical and physical fit. So if you think of what size are the boxes, and usage context and suitability. Can it be worn under dresses? So that's the next big bucket. That means people want to confirm that they're making the right decision about the product. But at the same time, this is when the market nuances really come in, because yes, utility in mind, but that is what the UK users are prompting about the most as well. These are the leading two categories in that product evaluation stage. And you can see the disparity in that market asymmetry in utility really come into force, where for prompts around billing and account care in the US being 16 times what in the UK. And it makes sense. As you saw earlier, if you get a response that simply points you to a section of the site, it's not that useful for you. But I found this really interesting that, at least for now, that comparative selection is such a big factor in the US, as you said, Max, based on your experience. When that comes over to the UK market, it'll be interesting to track that utility.
So we're specifically talking about this feature where Rufus can generate tables in comparison tables, which obviously, which seems to now be the number one use in the US. So obviously a great feature. So if the PM of UK Rufus is listening, that's what we need over here. I think that would be very cool, especially when you're looking at supplements or fitness and calories and all this kind of stuff.
For sure. I think one other insight on this that is actually quite prominent when you think about it is discovery and inspiration being only 5% in the US, and in a similar way, 4% in the UK. What is that? That is you discovering new products or asking something very top of funnel as an intent. That is actually quite rare. And Joe, you were making this point that people typically discover products on other platforms, whether that's TikTok. But when you start analyzing the likes of ChatGPT or Google Gemini, the majority of shopping-related prompts actually are that top of the funnel. We're seeing that Amazon is this transactional engine, transaction vehicle, and it's actually quite rare here because people are already mid-journey. They're not discovering products, they're making buying decisions, and Rufus is being utilized to help them along that journey.
I think it's interesting because a lot of the narrative, let's say 2 years ago, was like, okay, Rufus is replacing keywords, keyword optimization, etc. And the reality is that I feel like Rufus is just transforming the customer journey. So I feel like there's always the desire for options and for person. And so like beforehand, the comparison method would be we open a results page and we'll open 20 tabs to compare manually these pages individually by speed scrolling. And now essentially the customer still wants the choice of getting down to the specific niche category.
As Joe reconnects, we'll just take one of the questions. So Swagger, our good friend Swagger asks, is your intent more balanced due to greater usage and more functionality? The answer being yes, I think
so.
is your
Absolutely. And I think, Joe, if you're back now, also a great point there of the model I remember utilizing was Google published it in 2019, the Google's messy middle research, and they published multiple iterations of this, was this concept of it's not a linear purchase journey for users. In fact, it's quite a messy journey, and they call that the messy middle, where users get stuck in this recurring loop of exploration and evaluation. And that's exactly what you said, right? Is when people open those multiple tabs and they start comparing features. Max, as you said, when those comparative selection tables come out, that is a shortcut. That is a shortcut for you. And that's how Rufus helps you to push you down towards conversion.
So I'll just read this one out for Jonathan. And it's such a long question, we can't even see Autumn anymore. But the question is, are you seeing people prompt within Rufus the same way as they prompt within other LLMs like ChatGPT? Presumably the job to be done in Rufus is more purchase-centric versus ChatGPT, more informational request prompts.
Yes, so very different. And I think, as I just mentioned previously, within ChatGPT, it will be very much top of the funnel thinking. It'll be exploratory. Often people will start speaking about a category and get brand recommendations. Whilst here you can see that people are already in the midst of their shopping journey, and often that comparison selection, that means they're either exploring a category or comparing one product against another. And I think some of the other slides actually dive deeper into it. So maybe we should continue.
Yeah. Just one thought I had. I would have assumed that people use Rufus for a multi-step journey. Let's say I'm getting married next week, so I'm planning a wedding. Okay. What do I know? You're not going to, hopefully, I hope, buy your wedding stuff on Amazon, but let's say you're planning a bachelor party or whatever. Do you see that? Where did this come up?
Yes. So it's a large report. We do have some sections on this, but I think the next piece covers it in a way, because what we analyzed was also those conversational dynamics. What we saw from our research is that in comparison to the other LLMs, so ChatGPT, Gemini, the Rufus conversations are actually much shorter, which is possibly a good thing if you're trying to make this as an engine to force people to convert. You don't want people having long conversations within the Amazon UI. But what we analyzed here was, what are the follow-on prompts that users are making? So we saw 43% of all sessions have 2 or more prompts within them. So what are they? So we categorize them into 4 categories, as you can see on the screen. So refinement, so are they adding constraints? Clarification, are they asking for more details? Or are they asking for entirely different products? Or lastly, are they switching to a different topic? And this also gets quite interesting, because as a share of the kind of the total sessions, you start seeing 3 patterns emerge. You start seeing clarification in the US, 25% for those who are listening, and refinement, 21%, being quite common. So the way I see it is, people have an existing product, they've already prompted Rufus, they just want to learn more about it through clarification or refining the query slightly. The next insight here is that 24% in the US are asking another product question. I read that as comparative intent. So they are not just information gathering like the prior two. Here they are evaluating against another product. And because of that utility difference, I think that's why in the UK, that intent is actually 37%, that much higher. And lastly, I think the thing you also get as a confirmation on is that within your shopping journey, you're probably set on one price. You want to accomplish one mission. You don't want to topic switch. And that's what we see in the data. Topic switch in the US is 7%, only 3% in the UK, because you can actually do less with Rufus in the UK. That also makes a lot more sense to me. Shall we go on? Let's get to the next one. So third way of classifying the Rufus prompts. And here specifically, we classified not sessions, but prompts. And we thought, given that Amazon has created this taxonomy that they call the e-commerce question answering, or EQA taxonomy, that they use to improve their own systems, we thought, hey, let's take a notebook from Amazon and utilize their own taxonomy. And the insight here, put simply, is that factoids, that means almost a statistic or very simple yes or no answer to a question, lead the way. There are 49% of all Rufus prompts in the US, even greater, 75% in the UK. And that means people ultimately are using Rufus for quick factual answers instead of going through that product display or a detail page to answer and learn what it is. So that makes sense. It's a shortcut to get to the answer. And I think one of the commenters earlier also mentioned, why is US so different? You're starting to see this really come out, is US prompts are actually much more diverse as well. You're starting seeing much more comparison prompts. Just look at the difference in the post-purchase prompts as well. So that means people are, when you start looking into the examples, that means people have made a purchase and they said, that product didn't come in time, or I have an issue with the product. People are making those sort of prompts in the US because Rufus can answer those prompts, whilst in the UK, given the functionality is not there, it's not really being utilized that way, at least yet. Cool. And one last thing, the last classification here was also the prompt complexity. So this is more of, if you're sitting on Amazon side, how complex is the prompt that you as an LLM are trying to solve? So we categorize here in 3 distinct categories. Is it a simple retrieval? So that would be a prompt such as, how big are the pockets? Is it a contextual or situational? So slightly harder to understand. Can an item be worn for long runs? And lastly, is it constraint based? So prompt could read, show me dual rotor designs under $60. So you can see that there's much more processing in play there. You can see this on the chat. It's clear that most of the user prompts are very simple, and it's probably good for Amazon. It's more details about the product. It's that shortcut to information without having to read. But what's interesting, again, is that given that the US queries are much more diverse, they are also more complicated. And you start seeing this in the charts to the right. So those sections combined are 1.5x more common and more complex than the UK. So that means in the US, people are starting to utilize Rufus for very much more complex queries, which is also quite a good thing.
Fascinating. It's a quiet podcast because my mind is whirling with so many thoughts, but no, this is really interesting data.
Brilliant. Let's, in that case, take a break from the charts because that was quite heavy. So we covered demographics. We covered what happens within the prompt intent itself. And one thing that we'll generate, of course, is start a rolling tracker so we can share these insights and see how specifically those UK behaviors evolve over time. But one thing that we also wanted to showcase is that Rufus is evolving quickly. Amazon, it keeps on adding new features, and naturally this will also change the way users prompt. And this can also likely change the way we all shop, which is going to be a fascinating development. So first thing we started looking at is something that has recently come out of beta. So those sponsored products prompts. For those listening, I'm sure you're familiar with the Amazon ecosystem, but I'll just hover over. Those are these little sponsored questions that come up on the product display page that a user can click that are generated, but also the advertiser actually pays for them. This is a way that Amazon is treating advertising within Rufus and ultimately will be driving money from it. Now, from our data, from that, again, a month sample, what we saw is that it's quite rare right now. I'm sure this will change, but under 2% of Rufus users are seeing, or at least are clicking, these sort of recommended prompts, and it makes up only 1% of Rufus sessions. Again, this will likely change. Of course, it will come into the UK, other markets. But what blew me away, I'd love to throw the question over to you, Max and Joe here, is that I didn't realize that the advertisers didn't actually have an option of what suggested questions come up. The way it currently works, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's based on the actual contents of that product display page, and it's all sourced from that automatically. So what do you think the advertisers think about this? And do you see that Amazon creating a way for advertisers to actually input their own queries in the future?
Well, you're absolutely correct. And if you've been listening to The New Frontier for a while, you'd know that we did a live podcast in Milan where Amazon launched this feature. And they invited a bunch of, I hate the word influencers, but Amazon influencers over to have this training on this new ads feature by the PM who basically designed it. And then we did some podcasting. So yeah, what you say is absolutely right. But of course, they're well aware of a pretty clear P1 is advertisers want to choose what prompts. I think they're going to want to choose what the response is. And I think that's the most interesting piece of like, why would you pay to click why choose Sony if Rufus is just going to generate what it normally does for you, and it doesn't persuade the customer to choose Sony. It just says. So I think it's interesting to watch how advertising is changing in this world of AI search. Obviously, I don't know if you have any data on ChatGPT. Obviously, ChatGPT are rolling out their ads. My personal view is this is more elegant than a ChatGPT ad because it doesn't feel like the response. As a user who has no understanding of how the LLM works or how the business models of selling the retail media works, this one feels a lot more genuine and clear what's sponsored and what isn't. And the ChatGPT one today feels like the whole answer is sponsored by the advertiser, which obviously is going to make people just move from ChatGPT, Anthropic. But yeah, it's a fast-moving space, and we're really in the early innings. But I don't know, Joe, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I actually feel like it's almost pointless to talk about this. Just look at it. It's 1.9% of Rufus users and 1% of Rufus sessions, which are anyway still a percentage of the total search. The reality is that from my point of view, Amazon is still figuring that whole piece out. This week, I wrote about the fact that there's all the rumors around Amazon essentially merging Rufus with the search bar. And there's the big question of, okay, how would this affect their massive ad business? And the reality is that I just don't think that they have figured this bit out. I think they are just in a massive stage of testing, and they are seeing what is the market from a consumer point of view doing in terms of noises, what are the sellers doing in terms of noises. But this is just so small. It's like, why are we even talking about it? It's going to change 50 times. That's my point of view.
Yes, I agree. But on your point, Amazon have already experimented with having Rufus as the main search bar. And I think that's something that Christian, who we've just highlighted here, did a post about. Again, I'm loving the chat, so keep it going, guys. Will this sponsor prompts follow a similar trend as SEM paid placements? Consumers see it as a first or second result, but conveniently scroll towards the third result, organic. Joe, what's your view?
It's the problem with right now is the whole question around advertising in AI chatbots is that there's a massive piece around consumer trust that none of these companies actually really know. And the reality is that the only way they're going to solve it is with more adoption and more data. The reality is that there is the older audience, which we just discovered is the main user of Rufus, is of course not going to really realize that they're talking with an AI, and therefore the perceived trust might be higher, and therefore the click might be higher. But for anyone who is younger and who
I think the older generation realize they're talking to an AI.
Okay, but like not everyone.
On the other end.
I wouldn't say that is the first thing that comes into mind. I don't think there is such a intense awareness yet. And especially if these users are not native ChatGPT users. I have these conversations all the time. Most people don't even realize if something is AI video generated or image generation. I think we still live in a massive bubble. We understand what we're dealing with, but majority of people actually, regardless of age, don't. And so going back to what I was saying is, I think the big tech companies like OpenAI, Amazon, anyone like Shopify, anyone who is dealing with customers, there is a massive piece of mistrust that it comes to, okay, you are recommending me something, but did somebody pay you for that? Is this a genuine recommendation, or is it really recommendation based on what you would recommend? And that's why I think even if you track OpenAI, they're rolling this very cautiously. And so the point here is that, again, the question really comes as how you position this ad, how ready is the customer to really trust this, being transparent, everything from UX and design in terms of differentiating the organic versus paid. I think there's just so many question marks. And I feel like right now it's just a matter of all of this maturing and customers becoming more and more comfortable with receiving information from AI and then figuring out, okay, that piece of the trust puzzle.
Just for the spirit of debate, Accenture research shows that consumers trust AI as one of the highest things. So 18% of consumers rate it as their most trustworthy source for purchase recommendations. And that's higher than social media, which is 15%. That's higher than their friends and family, which is 13%. That's higher than brand
society, oh my fucking God.
Than 10%. So it's the highest is a physical store at 19%, but then Gen AI like Rufus or ChatGPT is the second highest thing. And I think I agree with you, Joe. I think it's because people don't really realize, people assume that it's a super intelligent AI that's telling them the right thing. They don't realize that actually these things can be manipulated in the same way that SEO can be manipulated. My mum, again, older generation, maybe a heavy Rufus user, I'll have to ask tonight. She will always be sending me screenshots of ChatGPT saying, "Oh, this is what we should do for whatever, and it's just literally a screenshot of ChatGPT, and I'm like, Mum, you can't trust this, right? This is just hallucinated garbage of whoever's got their GEO, whichever restaurant has optimized the GEO versus, it doesn't mean anything. But I think they do. I think they trust it, and I think the reason they trust it is that you can have very intimate conversations with it, and that kind of builds trust, where you can talk about your deepest, darkest insecurities and feelings and all sorts of stuff.
But don't forget that these stats are right now based on AI chats that don't have ads, right?
Very fair, very fair. And that's it's very fair. And I think OpenAI are going to, I think we're witnessing the Netscape story again, where Netscape basically invented the browser, but eventually died to Internet Explorer and Google Chrome. And I think we may be witnessing that again with kind of this player that invents this incredible thing, but can't quite work out how to monetize or keep users or innovate fast enough.
One thing that we'll definitely try to do is to measure the outcomes of this. So Joe, to your point, once we get that statistical significance, and if people are indeed clicking on these suggested buttons, or Max, to your point, users who are exposed to ChatGPT ads or ads in AI mode or AI overviews will be able to see what does that actually lead to outcomes very soon. So I think that's on our roadmap.
And we have a fourth opinion here from Swagat. Consumers are mature. Paid is part of any media. Sometimes it's white noise, sometimes it helps, and sometimes it builds mental availability, which is a good point. Yeah, I agree. The consumers are probably not naive. They know that everything is being sold. Let's move on, but keep the comments coming in, everybody.
Yeah. Awesome. Last slide on this. Also, a forward-looking piece. I'm sure you've seen this. Amazon started launching scheduled actions, and we are going to be diving into this, really seeing what is the penetration rate of users actually utilizing this. But big picture, for those who don't know, you can now ask Rufus to essentially schedule a shopping reminder, or even say buy a specific book from a specific author on a regular cadence, which is mind-blowing. And it's moving Rufus from this informational agent to actually that execution layer. So
I think what's most interesting for this, if I may just jump in, is the categories that need to think about ACO and agentic commerce optimization. But when we started Azoma 3.5 years ago, it was for those high consideration categories. People doing tons and tons of research. Maybe they're buying a new watch or a new car or a new fridge, something which is very expensive, and you're asking Rufus. And now we're moving into this world where actually it's grocery, right? It's toilet paper. It's the things that you milk, right? Butter, snacks, the things that you know you need, but you don't really want to think about too much. Hey, Rufus, just integrate with my Alexa and refill my pantry every month when it runs out. And it's just so interesting how that the categories that need to be thinking about this most are changing, because you're never going to buy an expensive purchase on a scheduled action, are you? You're not going to buy a new dress or expensive makeup, but definitely in those kind of consumable categories, you will.
But now as a brand, you need to optimize for this. You need to optimize to be agent ready. Crazy. And that was it from the report. I think one thing just to mention is we're continuing our research. The next phase very much is focusing on the outcomes. So if people are using Rufus, are they spending more? And essentially, who is actually utilizing Rufus to drive higher order values? So that is all coming up. So watch this space.
That was incredible. I think for the folks listening, and I know there's actually many, and they want to go and use this in their business, maybe it would be helpful, Artem, if you could explain like how you collected this data, how many people participated in the panel, and just explain a bit about what's behind those findings.
So very high level, at Generate, we have this fully consented metered panel that collects data from multiple data sources, whether that is Clickstream, GenAI, app usage, e-receipts. For a specific piece of research, we focus specifically on Android usage in the UK and US. And when we spoke about the Rufus usage, we spoke about those different levels. So here we're looking at Rufus usage based on someone has actually submitted a Rufus prompt. So it was not any lower level action, such as clicking on the button, or be it starting to type within Rufus, but never hitting enter.
Yeah, and maybe I can add a bit more color because actually a generator is quite famous in the UK. Maybe in the US, people may, no offense, but may not have heard of it, but in the UK, they went on Dragon's Den, which is the equivalent of Shark Tank, and it was one of the kind of best pitches, I think, in the show's 20-year history. And your founder came on with his long flowing hair and said, everyone's stealing your data. As consumers, everyone's stealing your data and using it for different stuff. Generate, what you do is you can monetize your own data. So yeah, you're obviously selling data and tracking people in the same way that all panels do. But the difference is that people sign up to Generate and they can get little gift cards and whatnot for enabling you to be on this panel. And I know this because I'm sadly no longer using it on Generate, but I was for a very long time. I remember this very clearly because I used to watch Dragon's Den, and this is 10 years ago or something, right? So this is quite a cool way of collecting this data. And how many people were participating in this Rufus study that you've shown?
So for the Android piece specifically here was just over 50,000. But yes, we do help people earn passively by sharing their data. So yeah, thanks for calling that out.
Any last question, Jeff? I'll have a final question.
This was really interesting. Thank you, Artyom.
Last question then from me, if you have time. I think we discussed it, but how do you see the differences between Rufus usage and ChatGPT usage, Gemini usage? Like same folks, these 50K folks in the US and UK, like how do you see the difference?
So running that jobs to be done classification across the Rufus prompts, you just saw the outcomes, but also running that across the likes of ChatGPT, Gemini, it's vastly different. And even if you isolate the shopping queries, you can imagine that from a ChatGPT, Gemini perspective, it's much more discovery-led, whilst within Rufus, we saw it was comparative in nature. So that is very much also on our 2 research list that is coming up next. We simply didn't run out of time to include that within this piece of research, but that's the general trend. And I think that surprises the most. You would expect people to just use Rufus as any other LLM. In reality, it's so different. So that's why having this quote unquote ground truth of how users are actually prompting with them is valuable.
Great. That is a good bombshell to end it on. So Artem, if you want people reaching out, how can they reach out to you?
Brilliant. Add me on LinkedIn. The latest research is always in my links within the profile. And yeah, a lot more research is coming out soon. And guys, thank you so much for your time. This is great.
Thank you.